Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel. If you've never been here before, my name is Kylie, glad to have ya. If you have been here before and you saw my last video where I did top 50 final girls of all time, you might be questioning the title of this video. Even just doing 50 final girls, that was still limiting myself. But when it comes to final boys, I hope that you don't blame me, but obviously final girls are the much more consistent trope. So we're gonna be talking about 25 final boys today. It's still better than just a top 10. And before we even begin, I know that there's gonna be some that I missed, so please feel free to leave those down below, as well as all of your favorites. But at number 25 would be Nick Jones from the House of Wax remake in 2005. He's all the way at the bottom because for majority of the movie, he's not a super likable character. He has this whole weird evil twin thing going on for absolutely no reason because most of his actions in the movie would prove that he's pretty much a good guy. He just has a stank attitude until the very end, and then he and his sister, his twin sister, get closer and they bond and whatever. And if you saw my Final Girls video, then you know that I love a good family bond. It always just hits a real soft spot in me. At number 24 would be Peter Graham from Hereditary. In my opinion, he's somewhat of a hilarious final boy. This one is kind of complicated to explain because he wasn't really somebody worth rooting for. He was a terrible brother and just terrible family member overall. And then in the end, he's kind of facing all of the karma of what he did, and he is the host of King Paimon now. So while he himself might not be a great final boy, I think he has one of the best stories of any other final boy on this list. To be very fair though, he did go through some really traumatic stuff, and a lot of it wasn't necessarily his fault. He was just kind of neglectful, and he had a terrible attitude with his mother.
Don't you ever raise your voice at me! I am your mother!
Talk about an iconic scene. And Alex Wolff just breathed an insane amount of life into that character. His performance is phenomenal. Wait, Alex Wolff or Nat Wolff? I mixed them up, you know? So there is a lot of credit due to Peter Graham. At number 23 would be Danny Torrance from Dr. Sleep, not from The Shining. In The Shining, he's like 5 years old. He doesn't really do that much, and I think all the credit would go to Wendy. Oh my god, I didn't include Wendy in my final girls list. I'm gonna be sick. It's too late now. We live, we learn, we move on. I definitely prefer Danny Torrance from the book Dr. Sleep, but in the movie, they do still get across his relationship with the young girl really well. He is a really good protector. His willingness and bravery to get sober and to go back to the hotel to face this evil once and for all. And again, it's the actor. I love Ewan McGregor so much, but all credit where it's due, having to deal with Rose the Hat. She's a type of villain that is so unique. Like, I've never seen anything like her before. Obviously, we've seen like witches and stuff, but the ways that they maintain their power and their little cult, it's weird. So Danny Torrance, yes, he deserves some accolades. At number 22 would be Kyle from Never Hike Alone. I know that this is a fan film, but a lot of people from this channel have definitely seen it because I talk about it all the time. And speaking of, they are crowdfunding for Never Hike Alone 2, so again, that Indiegogo link will be down below. I think that I like him so much because I find him to be really relatable. I too make vlogs, I too love to go camping, I too love the wilderness, and there are just moments where he's sitting there and he's kind of hyping himself up to do a sponsorship or whatever, or just talk to the camera, and I was like, yes, that's me. So I know that he won't be quite as relatable to everybody, but I still think he deserves a place on this list. He suffered some fatal injuries, which always gives a final girl or boy bonus points in my opinion, because my personal threshold for pain is quite low. I'm very much a creature of comfort and I don't handle that well. So he's still running and fighting, and he's up against Jason. The performance of Jason with his machete in Never Hike Alone is some of the best out of any other Jason I've seen. So I appreciate Kyle and his wit and his physicality. Up next we have another face from Friday the 13th, and that would be Tommy Jarvis. I couldn't really specify from which movie, but definitely not part 5. I do kind of enjoy how he's more well-rounded in part 5 because he's in this place for people who have like cognitive disabilities, and he's just kind of dealing with his trauma, and there is kind of the whole mystery around if he's the killer or not. But in part 5, I do not love him as a character, do not love him as a final boy. In part 6, he's obviously doing the most. I think that most people who would sound off in the comments would be like, yeah, definitely from part 6. It's not really a question. I do love a man who drives a car real fast. But then also, Tom Matthews as Tommy Jarvis does show up in Never Hike Alone, though he does end up having more to do in Never Hike in the Snow, which you guys should should watch that as well. His arc is very reminiscent of Halloween, like when Laurie comes back as a legacy character, although I have to say that Vinny DeSanti did do it first. Never Hike Alone came out in 2017. So it's all of Tommy that I love, not just from part 6. Up next, this one, I mean, he's a real goofball, but that would be Shawn from Shaun of the Dead. I just love a good dark comedy, and I know you might be thinking that he doesn't really have the merit to make his way on this list, but to be fair, I think that sometimes it's fun when the idiot survives. I think it's really fun to break the tradition and to have an absolute goofball survive the apocalypse. And to give credit where it's due, his character also does have a lot of heart. He has so much care for the people around him, and especially his best friend, his comedy duo partner Nick Frost actually. And so a dark comedy about idiots surviving a zombie apocalypse has so much more emotion than it has any right to have. But Shawn is the character that creates all those positive vibes. And I think it's also worth giving him a little bit of credit that he has no desire to kill any of his peers who have turned into zombies. He actually has a really hard time with it because he's a guy with a big heart. So don't knock him until you acknowledge what credit he does deserve. At number 19, we have a movie that is just completely the opposite, but our final boy would be Will from The Invitation. The Invitation is so psychologically disturbing. It's the complete opposite tone of Shaun of the Dead. And for me, that's what makes his survival so impressive. I did also mention this in my Final Girls video, but psychological components of a movie always affect me far more than any of the brute force or the physicality of villains. It's when they have the ability to get into your head, because in here, it should be a safe space. No matter what's going on around you, you have almost full control. Like, you have the reins of what's going on in here. But an effective horror movie with good psychological elements or manipulative characters, they can make their way in there. And so I really admire characters who can make their way out of the other side of that. And Will is pretty well-rounded. We do see some physicality, we do see him hiding a bit, he's really smart, and he is one of the few characters in horror to say, hey, I think I want to get out of here, you know, before all the events transpire. So I feel like he's just a tad overlooked, and I had to put him on this list. At number 18, coming from one of my childhood favorite movies, would be Dr. Jennings from Arachnophobia. I don't know if he should have been further down on the list, like maybe. And I don't want to spoil Arachnophobia because I think it was a bigger movie back in the day. It came out in like 1993, but it is not a topic at all of mainstream horror conversation. So you should definitely watch the movie. I included him on this list mainly because of the climax and what happens in the very end. So no spoilers. I don't want to give it away. Just give this movie a go. At number 17 would be Paul Sheldon from Misery. He could have been higher just for the sheer amount of torture that he endured. However, that being said, he's pretty much incapacitated for majority of the movie. It is impressive that he was able to manage to overpower Annie Wilkes even in that condition. So I do give him props for that, but for a lot of the movie, he's just stationary. He had to use his mind a lot, and even in those really stressful conditions, his creativity was flowing and he made one of the best books he ever wrote. Also, I have to say that Paul Sheldon from the book did go through a lot more than Paul in the movie. Annie Wilkes was a lot more brutal in the book. I did put her on my list of top 30 scariest villains of all time. Did that video a long time ago now that I think about it, but definitely check that one out too. So a part of my reasoning for him being on this list is also because of Paul from the book. It's kind of like the opposite of a Good for Her movie where it's like, oh, poor him. Up next at number 16 would be Derek Cho from Mayhem. This is kind of an underrated movie, but I think it's still streaming on Shudder. It's a dark comedy and it also stars the lovely Samara Weaving. I have talked about this movie before. One of the main reasons why I love this movie is because there's this virus and it lowers the inhibitions of humans. So whatever their personality is, it's just amplified, and that's why people start to like kill each other and stuff. And the amplified version of himself is just somebody who hates rich people even more, and you have to respect that. So I love his character, and part of the reason why is because of that journey, because of the arc that he goes through, and ultimately just sticking it to the man, you know? That's my absolute jam, sticking it to the man. Ooh, and I love ham. I don't love ham, I'm just terrible at freestyling. Anyways, let's just move on to number 15, which would be Ed Warren from the Conjuring series. I think to me, what makes him so special is the way that he is willing to put his life on the line for not only his wife, but also any of the other people he's trying to help. And I know that the real life Ed Warren was actually disgusting, allegedly. But Ed Warren is played by our horror daddy Patrick Wilson, and the character of Ed Warren is very likable. I think what really gets me the most is all the ways that they try to round out his character by showing you just how much he loves his wife and his family. It's like all the gifts that he gives to Lorraine in the end of The Conjuring 3, where they have the gazebo and it's a replica of where they had their first dance or something like that. He's just so romantic. I feel like Ed Warren is written for the ladies. He's also been through a lot, you know? He's faced quite a few literal demons. But at the end of the day, I think again it's kind of like Shawn from Shaun of the Dead, you know? He's just a good guy. But moving on to our number 14 would be Dewey from the Scream franchise, but specifically from Scream 2 and 3. The reason why I love Dewey in those movies is because he just portrays the lovable goofball really well. In Scream 1, I'm like, you're just dumb and annoying. You're not lovable, you're just an idiot. And then in Scream 4, I'm like, you have this absolute bread-winning dime piece of a wife, and this is how you're gonna treat her? So the pendulum swung back the other way. And then Scream 5, well, couldn't really put him on this list if we were talking about Scream 5, but I do like him in Scream 5. So why Dewey made it up so high on this list is because I love Gail so much, and in 2 and 3, I feel like he's a really good counterpart to her character, because she's obviously an insanely smart and strong woman, and in those movies, he totally matches her energy. He calls her out on her lack of affection and her lack of willingness to get close to people, and eventually he wins her heart over. It's very sweet. So I have to say he's definitely one of the sweetest final boys. I also love that I think it's only in Scream 2 that he has his own score, and it makes me think that they want him to come across as some kind of cowboy, because it's like down 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 down. Anyways, we could talk about Dewey for a long time, but I'm just gonna move on. This is another fan favorite that you might be a little bit upset that he's so low on the list, but that would be Ash Williams at lucky number 13. I just don't really connect that much with the Evil Dead franchise. It's just not really for me. But Ash Williams, especially from the very first movie, I do kind of feel for him. But then in the second movie, you of course have that iconic moment where he loses his hand and then like duct tapes a chainsaw to his arm. Few other final boys have thought to do that. And I give him credit because I personally would not want to deal with my possessed undead girlfriend, and having all my friends die around me. That sounds rough. I do empathize. But other than that, it's hard to put him up higher on the list because Evil Dead 2 is a little bit confusing. It's almost a remake of the first movie, just with a lot more effects, but it's not ever really specified. Like, I'm so confused. Would Ash Williams really bring another girlfriend out to another cabin in the woods like that? Like I said, I just don't really get that franchise, but whatever. So moving on to number 12 would be Cole Seer from The Sixth Sense. This is one of those moments for me where it's like a child was going through that.
A child.
And if I put myself in those shoes, it's the same thing with like Coraline or Jamie Lloyd in Halloween 4. You throw me in there and I would not be able to handle myself. I would simply pass away. I watched that movie I think for the first time when I was like 11, and it was pretty traumatizing. Not to mention, for that whatever age he was as a kid, Haley Joel Osment's performance was insane. Like, he was out acting literally everybody else in the movie, and he was starring next to Bruce Willis and Toni Collette. Actually, I kind of partially take that back. I don't think that Toni Collette has ever been in a movie and not been the best thing on screen. But Haley Joel Osment was a child, so he gets bonus points. And it's for a similar reasoning. He's a child and he has really pure intentions. And also his willingness to help these ghosts no matter how frightening they look. Even though he's scared sometimes, he knows that at the end of the day, a lot of times these people just really need help. And if I was a kid, like I said, I think that I would just suffer a mental collapse. I don't think that I would be able to handle the weight of that. So he's definitely earned his spot on this list. But coming in at number 11 would be Martin Brody from Jaws. Again, he's better than me. You would never catch me going out on Weirdo Quint's boat, especially with the size of the thing. That boat is not big enough. Like, you could not pay me all the money in the world when you have a boat that big and a shark that big. Because as soon as that boat is sinking, that's when I would throw in the towel. I'd be like, okay, well, I'm done. And I'd be lying if that one line, "Smile, you son of a bitch," plus his perfect shot and the explosion, I'd be lying if I said that wasn't a factor in why he made it so high up on this list. He also had to deal with Richard Dreyfuss's character. I forget his name, but he is the shark scientist. And he is very annoying, but I feel like Sheriff Brody handled him well, and they actually ended up playing off each other in a good way. Not to mention, of course, you know me, you know the way that I love how he goes up against the mayor, who just wants wants to reopen the beaches for business because he wants that coin. And Sheriff Brody genuinely cares about the safety of the people. You also do get to see his family dynamic and how much he worries for and cares for his wife and kids. So just a really well-rounded final boy. We are now in our top 10, so coming in at number 10 would be David from Life. He made it here because he is basically the Ripley of Life. I have talked about this before. Eventually at some point I am gonna make an original versus remake video on Alien and Life. Even though Life is not technically a remake, it pretty much is. Like, it borrows so many different plot elements and the story is the same, a lot of the characters are similar. So that video is definitely coming. I'm gonna save a couple of my thoughts for now. But David, I think that I like him so much because number one, what he had to deal with. This is just another one of those final boys where I would never want to be in his shoes. The alien in that movie is at least top 3 scariest animals from any creature feature that I've seen. So wouldn't want to deal with that. But also at number 2, he maintains his composure the entire runtime. He just keeps his head about him, he gets through difficult situations, and he looks out for all of his fellow crew members. And maybe it's a little bit debatable if he's a final boy, but you should just watch the movie and you can decide for yourself. Let me know down below. But I think that they also set up his character really well. They established that he's been up in space for over a year. And it seems like it's because he's just one of those guys who is willing to put himself in danger and just do whatever he needs to for the greater good. So really strong character, and that's an obvious theme in this video, but that's why I love him so much. Coming in at number 9 would be Richie Tozier from It Chapter 1 and 2, but I would say specifically more so from It Chapter 2. I really love him in part 1, obviously, because he's hilarious. He knows how to turn around any terrible situation. But then in part 2, you find out so much more that has been suppressed about his character, like how he's never been openly gay and how much he loves Eddie. I think honestly too, it is Bill Hader's performance, because you just feel the love and the heartache and everything that he has to go through. I'm like, I want to give you a hug. I think he also goes through a really good arc as well, where he kind of goes from denial to facing the obstacles in front of him and being there for his friends. Plus, yet again, wouldn't want to be in his shoes, wouldn't want to deal with this alien clown thing that's showing me my deepest fears. Definitely one of the worst scenarios on this list. Coming in at number 8 would be the boys from The Thing. So RJ and Childs. I love that this movie has 2 final boys. Obviously, RJ is the main character. He's doing the most. He's solving all the riddles. He's figuring out who's who and who's the thing. He's setting up all these traps. At the end of the day, he is kind of the one to kill it. But I had to throw some love for Childs as well. Generally, I wouldn't group 2 people in one, but I think that this is fine. It's mainly because of the scene that they share together in the very end of the movie. I think that they just complement each other well. Kurt Russell is also definitely giving action hero in this movie, and I kind of love when that happens in a horror movie, just because I want more action horror. There's not really enough of it out there. So to have an action hero final boy, that's something that I really appreciate. Coming in at number 7 would be Josh Lambert from Insidious. Again, it's our horror father, Patrick Wilson. It's such a common theme, I know, but just bear with me as I tell you again, I love this man's familial bonds and how that plays out in those movies. He has so much love for his boys to the point where he is willing to go into the further and confront an actual demon to save his son. Not only that, but then he gets stuck there and he has to find some way to make it back to his family, and lo and behold, he does. Insidious is one of the movies that I've seen I think 5 or 6 times now, and still every single time that I watch it, something scares me. I love and hate the concept of the further because it is so freaky, and Josh was dealing with that from a very young age, only to then have to grow up and have his son go through the same issue and then get roped back into it and face demons as an adult. So I have a lot of respect for Josh Lambert, as you can probably tell. The same can be said for our number 6 final boy, which would be David from The Crazies. I love The Crazies so much. This is probably top 10 favorite horror movies of all time for me. I think it's because no matter how many times I watch it, the tension of that movie is so insanely palpable, and it doesn't really make sense because I feel like even now, if I were to rewatch Insidious, I think I would be okay. Still never watched it alone, and I've definitely never watched The Crazies alone for the same reason, because it still gets under my skin every single time. And it also kind of poses somewhat of a moral dilemma for our characters, because it's a very unique zombie virus in which, for the most part, for most of the time when these people are sick, they're still themselves. There is still a little piece of who they are within this infected person. So it makes it that much harder to kill them, that especially because it's a very small town, so everyone knows each other really intimately. And so it takes quite an obvious amount of strength to be thrown into that situation and deal with it and get you and your partner out alive. So it's another one of those situations where he's dealing not only with physical threats, but it's also very psychologically tumultuous. And I love Timothy Olyphant, I cannot deny that, but I don't even think that has that much influence as to why I love the character so much. I couldn't really tell you what it is about him. He's just such a good guy. Okay, we are now in the top 5, and coming in at number 5 would be Andy from the Child's Play franchise. Specifically, I want to say from Child's Play 2, because at that point, that kid's acting was amazing. Not super great in the first movie, and then we actually have a different actor for Child's Play 3, so I don't really want to talk about that. But again, this is another scenario where if I was in the shoes of that child, I would simply evaporate. I was really scared of dolls when I was a little kid, specifically because of these movies. I didn't actually watch these movies as a kid, but my uncle really loved them, and so I had seen some pictures of Chucky at some point, also maybe like at Universal Studios, and just based on those images alone and the concept, I was horrified of dolls. So if I was actually like a 6, 7, 8-year-old kid dealing with Chucky, no, I wouldn't be, because I would evaporate. So that is why I admire Andy so much, particularly in Child's Play 2. You also better believe that I talked about Kyle during my favorite Final Girls video, but it's hard. I don't have much more to say beyond that because I feel like it really speaks for itself. A child having to fight a serial killer doll who's almost the same size as him, where the climax of the movie happens in this giant terrifying factory. No thanks, no gracias, I'm good. Coming in at number 4 would be a fan favorite, but that would be Chris from Get Out. So he went through undeniable hell. I think what I respect about Chris the most is that during the entire duration of this movie, he always had his head on about him. There were all these little idiosyncrasies with this family that were weird, but I think that a lot of average people, a lot of white people, to be fair, would overlook those things. But Chris was absorbing all of that, and he was taking stock. I think it's lovely that Jordan Peele flipped that trope on his head, where his main character was making really smart decisions throughout. He just was in such a terrible situation that unfortunately was not enough to save him before all the crazy stuff went down. And again, he had a really good arc. He had some of his trauma from his childhood unearthed, and then he had to go through hypnotism, being trapped in the sunken place, fighting off an entire family of racists, and having some fatal injuries to boot, plus learning that his girl that he was in love with was actually a sociopath. That must have been really difficult. So all respect to Chris, he is an instant classic, instant favorite final boy. At number 3 would be Dr. Miles from Invasion of the Body Snatchers in 1953. I feel like he's really overlooked, probably because he is in a movie from the 50s and not everybody watches movies that are that old, but I just have such a soft spot for Dr. Miles, and obviously I love this movie. It's one of the very first horror movies that I've ever seen. That is definitely a bias that comes into play, I can recognize that, but I just love Dr. Miles so much because the main theme of this movie is about humanity. It's about how our emotions and love is what makes us human. So that's what he's fighting for the entire time. He doesn't want him and his ex-girlfriend to become pod people and become emotionless. They want to love and they want to be loved, and as a romantic, that really hits close to home. And it's another one of those movies where it's like, oh, poor him. So maybe he didn't deserve to make it quite so high up on the list, but as a romantic person, I would be remiss if I didn't put him at number 3. Coming in at number 2 would be Cole from the Babysitter movies. I think I would say mainly from the Babysitter Part 1. He's just a really cool kid. Like, I love his personality, I love his character, and also, yet again, the things that he goes through in that movie and his bravery, it really comes through. I'm really impressed with the decisions he made, with the way he maintains his composure, the way that he stands up to the people who want to torture and kill him, and he's really smart. He sets trap. He's like Kevin McAllister. So how can you not respect that, you know? And I still love him in The Babysitter Part 2. But are we ready for my number 1 final boy in all of horror history? This might be a point of contention. I know he's not going to be the most popular one on this list for many of you, but that would be Meryl from Signs. Again, it's just a soft spot. It's the fact that this is one of my favorite movies of all time, one that my grandpa showed me, one of the first horror movies I ever saw, and above all the other final boys on this list, Meryl is the one who exhibits these amazing family bonds the most. I love the family in Signs so much, and Meryl definitely has that lovable idiot energy, but you know his heart is so pure because over the course of the movie you learn that he, you know, moved in with his brother because his wife passed away and he wanted to be there for him and for his kids. He also has so much respect for his older brother. Like, one of the kids at some point point tells him, I wish you were my dad. And he's like, don't you ever say that. Your dad loves you so much, etc., etc. So even though he's the cool, fun, idiot uncle, he also has so much love and respect in his heart. And not to mention, he swings away, okay? He has the final showdown of the movie. I hope that's not anticlimactic because he didn't have the most physical role and he didn't go through the worst scenario, certainly on this list, but he's just my favorite character. Like, he's just the most lovable guy. And also, all of that being said, I think that this list is a lot more fluid than my final girls list. This one, I have to say, feels a lot more influenced by all of my recent watches, whereas with my number one favorite final girl, I feel like she only really rotates with a couple other ladies. My number one final boy, and even honestly like my top 5, could be pretty interchangeable at any given time. So I would love to know who your top 5 final boys are, or if you don't have 5, just let me know your very favorites. As always, of course, I want to thank my lovely patrons. I got like 5 new ones this past month, so welcome everybody. If you would like some bonus content, over there I do post my initial reactions to movies as soon as I get out of the theater. So it's an uncut, raw first reaction to movies like X or Morbius, that's all on there. So if you'd like to further support me and get credit at the end of my videos, then that will be linked down below, as well as all my other social media, my little social justice spotlight, all that good stuff. I hope that you enjoyed this video, and I hope I catch you in the next one. Bye!